Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I will call us into order for this work session of the Public Works Commission. And I will start by doing a quick roll call. If you are here, please let me know by saying aye. Commissioner Ellis.
Here.
Commissioner Hilton.
I'm here.
Commissioner Crowley.
Here.
Commissioner Morgan.
Here.
And Commissioner Collette.
Here.
Awesome. Sounds like we are all here. I'd also like to recognize that we have both of our City Council liaisons here, City Council members Willits and Bajent. Thanks for joining us for this work session.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. All right, let's get right to work. The first item on our agenda is an overview of the Clean City Index, and I will turn it over to staff for presentation.
Chair Gravatt, thank you. And our first topic is our Clean City Index. This is an initiative that came out of the transition reports when Mayor McLean took office. And I'll turn it over to Steve Hubble, who's going to walk us through the information that was gathered and then has some specific questions, areas for feedback from the commission. So Steve.
Thanks, Steve. Can everyone see the presentation slides?
Looks like that's a yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, commissioners. It's nice to see everyone. Excited to give you all an update on the Clean City Index project this afternoon and look forward to discussion and feedback. So just quickly, we'll run through our agenda. The first part of the presentation, I'm going to have a few slides to discuss some background and the development of the index. And then we'll have a discussion topic for your input. And then from there, we'll transition to talking a little bit about implementation. And then following that, have another point for commission input. And then last but not least, this is a work session and information only topic. And so last year, the Climate Action Division was tasked with developing the Clean City Index, and we completed the analysis this past fall. The purpose of the index is to develop and better understand citywide baseline data for environmental, health, and equity considerations. As the project commenced, we identified existing related resources, including the community development analysis, the cover of which shown in the middle of the screen there. This document was developed in 2019 by Housing and Community Development, which is part of the city's Planning and Development Services Department. And the work that they developed served as the starting point for the Clean City Index. Additionally, we reviewed similar projects from several other cities, most notably the one shown here, which was the Climate Equity Index for the city of San Diego, California. The previously developed community development analysis focused primarily on health and housing, so it's necessary to identify additional data sources related to the environment and equity. To identify this additional data, we reviewed national sources like the American Community Survey from the US Census and the Environmental Justice, or EJ Screen tool from the US Environmental Protection Agency, as well as other local and regional data sources. An important consideration in the process was determining the appropriate geographic scale for the index. Matching the prior work that we saw in the community development analysis and the examples that we reviewed from other cities, while considering the scale of data that was available, we found that data at the census tract level was most appropriate. And for reference, Boise has a total of 49 full or partial census tracts that cover the city. A broad range of potential data indicators and metrics at the census tract scale were identified and evaluated. Data indicators and metrics were finalized after eliminating those that were not statistically significant or those that did not offer significant value to the index. And so this slide shows the final results of the index in terms of the indicators and data that was included. So we had 5 indicators that were primarily environmental focused, which you can see in the table on the right: air quality, land, water, waste, and natural hazards. And then to accompany those, we identified 11 specific data metrics to try to address some of the environmental considerations that go into the index. And I'll show you all of those specifically on the next slide. And then for equity and health, we identified 7 indicators that you can see on the right: demographics, education, health, housing, equity, energy, and transportation. And then to accompany those indicators, we selected 23 individual data metrics, again, that I'll review on the subsequent slide. And so this breaks that down in detail. You can see all the specific points of data that went in to develop the Clean City Index, all 34 of them. The items that are shown in red on the slide were used in the previously developed community development analysis, and the items in the black text were new to build out some of the additional data needs around the environment or around equity and health. And so after we finalized the selection of all the environmental indicators and metrics, we weighted all 34 of them equally and then quantified them into quartiles across the city's 49 census tracts to develop a prioritization map. And so that map is shown here. So again, we took all of those 34 data metrics, we weighted them equally, and then we divided them into quartiles amongst the 49 census tracts. So you get approximately 12 census tracts per priority ranking. So with the map, those areas shown in the darkest blue rank as the highest priority, indicating that those census tracts face higher challenges based on the data that was developed for environmental justice, health, and equity. And then the prioritization moves to lower as you move from the blue into the teal or the lighter shades of green. And so it's important to emphasize that this map presents the results of the specific quantitative data analysis that was completed with this project. It should not be interpreted as a qualitative comparison between different areas of the city. And it's also important to share that we see this as the first step in the development of this tool. We'll find opportunities with future revisions to develop or utilize more local data and to define, add, or delete additional metrics. And so with that, I can certainly answer any questions about the background information, but we wanted to obtain some reactions from the commission about how we might go about communicating the results of the Clean City Index with our community. And as you can tell just from the little that you've seen, communicating about this topic could be pretty tricky because there could be some folks that see that map and might suggest that we're demonstrating that one neighborhood or one area of the city is better than another. And again, that's certainly not the intent. So the first discussion topic for the work session is to get some input from the commission on how we go about communicating these results to the community.
I have a question.
Yeah, Commissioner Collette.
Would you mind just going back a slide and going back to the map, please?
Sure.
So I think just the way the legend is written, perhaps not saying priority, but maybe saying need, might just change the perception, because it's, if you say priority, people don't necessarily understand, well, who's prioritizing it? What does priority mean? Is it a government priority or is it a people priority? When it's a need, I think that is more indicative of the population versus the government. So that might just help with perception.
Chair, Commissioner Collette, thanks for that comment. We've had actually a lot of discussion about that particular word choice in the index, so I really appreciate that comment.
Awesome. A quick point of clarification, then I'll get to some of the other commissioners. What are the numbers representing in this map?
Chair, thanks for that question. So those numbers are specific IDs for the census tracts. Each of them have a multi-digit code to demonstrate them. And certainly, I suspect this might be one of your suggestions, but one of the things that we'll need to do is translate this to the neighborhood nomenclature rather than the census tract nomenclature, because this certainly is not a scheme that's familiar to most residents.
Right. Awesome. Thank you. I see Commissioner Crowley, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Steve, going to Kylene's question, on the same slide, the variations of the color scheme, is it fair to assume that those that you have marked as high priority have differing issues that need to be dealt with in terms of environmental issues or the criteria that you've just outlined? And if so, how are those differences reflected, and how much of a difference does it make for an area that is designated as high priority and surrounded by medium high priority? What would it take to take the medium high to high? What's the dynamic that's going on? What's driving some of this? And it's how sensitive are some of the issues that, or the metrics that you've identified? It's curious to me as to the areas seem very discrete in terms of the lines, which is puzzling.
Chair, Commissioner Crowley, let me do my best to talk through that and certainly jump in if I can clarify anything as I go through the response. So I backed the slide up just to show the 34 individual data metrics again. So behind each of these items, like particulate matter, like population density, like some of the others that you see, there are raw numbers that were extracted from the various data sources that were provided. And so we took all of those for each of the metrics and then ranked them from either highest to lowest in some instances, or depending on the data point, some were the inverse, so lowest to highest. And then without a weighting, we averaged those across all 49 of these census tracts that you see on the map. And so depending on each individual metric is a kind of a determination of what the variation is amongst the different levels of priority. So when you group them all together, this was how they ranked out. But for example, if you start to pick them apart and look at them individually, you may see different trends. So for example, I'll just point to the first one on the list, the air quality component. All in all, that data citywide ranks very close together. So there's not very much variation across the different census tracts in the city for that particular point. Some of the others, we saw a very wide range in the different data. So if you started to look at these independently, you might see different trends than you see on the combined map here. The other thing I'll speak to just in response, and then I'll pause and see if you have additional questions, is we did also look at, in looking at the environmental indicators that are shown on the left, separately from the equity and health indicators, which are shown in the center and the right. And you see a pretty interesting trend when you do that. When you isolate out the environmental indicators, the area of priority or need, or whatever word choice you want to use, move to the geographic edges of the city, driven by some of the data points there. And then when you transition over to only looking at the equity and health indicators, you see that the areas of priority move to at least what's shown as the geographic center of the city. So essentially the opposite. And again, I want to stress that there's no weighting of one particular of these 34 metrics. However, just in terms of the raw numbers, there are 23 equity and health indicators and only 11 environmental. So it is slightly weighted just because of the difference in the numbers in those two subsets of data.
Given all that, Steve, would it make sense to have a series of maps rather than one map that shows, and you can kind of think of this as overlays, where the first map may address air quality for the entire city without any lines. It's just air quality overlaid on your map. And then on top of that, I guess the other question is, how big a deal is wastewater discharge, and how does that fit into the scheme of things, and how much importance does one put on that compared to some of the other items, the metrics that you've got listed? The exposure to hazardous substance sites, for example, or proximity to waste management might be something that would be more of a concern. Wildfire, flood, those are things that have got to be a concern. So I'm just wondering if in terms of how you present this to the community and how people respond to it, there could be a number of different ways that people can respond in terms of how they view where they're located and the value of the property within which they lie, depending on the color of the maps and what have you. So I'm just wondering if there's a way to mute that, so that it doesn't come across as being so concentrated, but you have a series of issues that can be overlaid without necessarily resulting in one particular area being specifically identified and designated as being in real trouble vis-a-vis other parts of the city.
Chair, Commissioner Crowley, those are all great points. I think we have a lot of options when we roll this out, particularly with some of the mapping tools that we have available to figure out ways to provide that flexibility. And then I think also when we jump to the implementation section, I can touch a little bit on how the tool might be used. And there may be some scenarios where it makes sense to look at these points aggregated for certain lines of work. And then there may be others where it would make sense to sort of hone in on specific data points.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
Yeah, thank you. It sounds like a dashboard with many layers maybe in the works.
Mm-hmm. You're right.
Commissioner Ellis.
Thank you. Mine is more a comment than a question. I just wanted to give you my gut reaction when I saw this. It's very interesting. And I can see there's a lot of layers in here, but I wanted you to know that I thought of a book that I read recently called Greening Healthcare. And it's really interesting. Towards the end of the book, they talk about community health initiatives, and they're looking at environmental regional priorities. They're looking at regional health issues, and then they try to figure out how to look at, they call it upstream, midstream, and downstream. And so one of the examples they gave was they looked at the numbers of asthma cases in the area, and they actually took an initiative to fund home visits that would help educate families so that they could try to counteract asthma issues. And they saw the number of results they saw good results from that. The numbers went down. So it's just interesting as they're going to be looking at all of this. And I could see hospitals in particular when we've got examples here in town where, they're looking at ways to help fund community health initiatives. And this is going to be something really interesting for them. And so you can keep that in mind, that they would probably be good ones to look at to test this out on.
Chair, Commissioner Ellis, thank you. At a high level, we're always looking at ways to connect our climate work to health. And that was one of the guiding principles in our climate action roadmap. And I think what you described there is certainly one of the ways we'd like to see implementation come out of this. And we are also not only thinking of this as a tool that the city would use, but that external partners could use as well. So I appreciate that.
Chair Gravac, if I could just add something, Commissioner Ellis, just an anecdote, and I think I have most of the facts right. The city of Columbus back several years ago was putting in a grant application for a large transit grant. And the foundation of their grant application was to address infant mortality in minority populations. And you're thinking to yourself, well, this is a transit grant. What does that have to do? And the correlation that Columbus made was one of the primary drivers of mortality was a lack of access to healthcare early in pregnancies and throughout pregnancies for minority populations. And so they were making that link. So what we may see, to your point, is that you might find linkages in data sets that you weren't necessarily expecting. And maybe even to Commissioner Crowley's point, like being able to toggle different data sets off and on, you might see some things that you weren't expecting. So.
Commissioner Collette.
Sorry, I just had one more comment, and you touched on it, Steve. I do think it makes sense to, at a minimum, have two maps, because to take your environmental indicators and then your equity and health indicators and combine them into one, they just seem like such completely different things to kind of be bundling into one and then kind of just putting that information out there, right? I think separating those two out at a bare minimum would be helpful, and just in terms of people being able to kind of understand what it is that they're looking at, because they would, if I look at like wildfire risk and flood risk, those are negative things, but I would think that a lot of those things happen probably in wealthier areas, right? If you're along the river, that's expensive property. If you're out in the foothills, it's a fire hazard, but that's wealthy property. And so it's a hazard, but it's still, I just think it would help to make the information a little bit more clearer to understand.
Chair, Commissioner Collette, it's ironic we've been having some of those exact discussions as we've rolled this out to larger groups internally. In terms of the first part on data display, it's interesting. We've looked to several other cities examples of how they've done this work, and for example, the San Diego example, they share kind of a very static version, sort of similar to what you see here. Here it is for the community. This is what we think the results are. We're going forward and implementing. And then we see another example in Richmond, Virginia, where, pursuant to what Commissioner Crowley's comments were, you have a very interactive mapping tool where residents can really pick and choose some of the data points that are important to them. So I think there's a lot of options on the table there. And then in terms of the second part of your comment, we've very much been thinking about how each of these environmental indicators, so the 11 kind of big picture categories, aren't all speaking to necessarily the same frontline communities in terms of climate risk. And we're working to kind of define better what that means as we move into some of the implementation. And I think that'll help guide how we use the tool, maybe again on kind of the combined or ranking in its entirety, or whether we start to parse out certain data points for certain projects and programs.
Commissioner Morgan.
Thanks, Chair. I had a question on what is the purpose of educating the public? Like, I understand that as a broad, like we want to include the public in this, but I wanted to know the specific goals, like what we were hoping to get from the public, so that way we had a better idea of like recommendations for the things that we're giving to the public.
Chair, Commissioner Morgan, I think we're really at the beginning stages of exploring that. So I don't know that I can give you a concrete answer. We really haven't done much sharing of the tool externally yet. We want to be very deliberate in terms of how we share it externally, because we know it's complicated and it could get it could be tricky to communicate about. One thing that we have heard from city leadership is that before we start that communication, we want to be able to make very clear to the public how we're going to use the tool. So we're continuing to work with the mayor's office and city council to make those determinations prior to any broad rollout. So I think more to come, but kind of the answer that I can give to that question at this point.
Thanks, Steve.
I do see a lot of utility in this just as a member of the public and as someone engaged in a neighborhood association as well. One of the not concerns, but just something that I'm really curious about is how some of these are defined. Because some of these they seem pretty straightforward in being able to define, like K-12 school enrollment, these different sort of more quantitative measures, but how do we measure things like access to healthy food, access to arts and cultural amenities? And I also see that access to public transit is different color than the rest. I don't know if that's specifically calling out that metric or not.
Chair, I can speak to that a little bit. So all of these metrics are backed up mostly by national data sources. So a lot of the information comes from the census. So we can go to each one of these and identify kind of how that data was collected and specifically what the analysis is. So certainly for anybody who's interested in a deep dive, we can provide those specific informations. Most of the 34 are sort of in that range, sourced from readily available, quality controlled data that has a good process for being collected. There were a few that we developed in-house using local data sources or city data sources. And that's not to suggest that those aren't of high value, but just to note a different source there. And then as we're going around and speaking to different groups and learning, it's inevitable that we get a suggestion for, oh yeah, we like this particular data set on wildfire risk, for example, but have you considered that data set? And certainly we are open. We're not intending this to be static. We think there are options to update, include new information over time, and then refine. It'll be tricky how we do that, particularly if we ever consider using the tool to kind of assess progress or change over time. But again, we see this as a start, not a finish, and lots of opportunities there.
Awesome, thank you. Commissioner Ellis.
I wanted to follow on with Commissioner Morgan's question. I'd like to test what my assumption is for the goal is that one of them would be this idea of livability, this tagline that we have. We want to be the most livable city in the US. And then also when people are looking to move here, it's a scorecard for people to look at certain things when they're deciding whether to move to Boise. So I figured those are two standouts of what the use is, other than just a general scorecard, kind of grading our overall health. Do you have any comments about what you think about those three assumptions?
Chair, Commissioner Ellis, I think I'll just thank you for those suggestions at this point. We're very early on in the process, but I think we're open to all opportunities for potential usage, and we can certainly take those into consideration as we build out with implementation.
Chair Gravett, I'd just add to Steve's comment that Commissioner Ellis, the intent certainly would be to track this data over time, and where we may have areas that aren't necessarily scoring well, what can the city do to make investments in those areas to try to change some of those data sets? So I think this is also a view of how the current state of the city and where do we want to try to address some of the issues that residents experience at Boise. So over time, I think we'd like to track this information to see what kind of difference some of the investments are making.
Commissioner Collette.
So yeah, just a comment on that and kind of the discussion that we had before about, how much of this becomes publicly accessible, because I can't help but think it's really important to identify which areas need help so that the city can target helping those areas, but that those areas don't end up then getting punished, because as people are moving into the city, and which we're already mentioning it being a scorecard, and if people are looking at certain areas and thinking, well, I'm not going to invest in those areas because those are bad areas for whatever reason it may be, I think we just need to be very careful about how it's presented.
Chair, Commissioner Collette, excuse me. Yeah, definitely agree with those comments. And Chair, if it's okay with you, just kind of minding my time, I may move in to the implementation slides. There's just 3, and then we can continue the discussion if that's okay with you.
Absolutely. Take it away.
Great. Thank you. So, as you all have discussed, the index does suggest that there certainly are opportunities within the city to address some of the environmental justice, health, and equity challenges that we're seeing in the priority areas that the index has identified. And as we see current and future impacts from climate change, addressing these challenges provides an opportunity to improve the resilience in our community. The identification of these priority areas also provides an opportunity to integrate additional considerations around environmental justice, health, and equity into citywide project and resource prioritization. So maybe in other words, seeing this as initially as a climate action tool to help us program work within that specific area, but also seeing it to potentially have broader applicability across a wider range of city programs. And then to that comment, the index provides some additional data and a supplemental tool to support decision making. It can help us prioritize our climate action work, but it can also, again, fit into that broader range of city decision making. As we touched on a little bit in the question and comment time, it's not likely to be a one-size-fits-all tool, but for example, it could be used in combination with other project prioritization and decision-making mechanisms. So for example, if a city department has a developed process to prioritize their work, they could continue on with that process to get the results. But then could this tool come on at the end to sort of be a differentiator, assuming 2 projects are equal in all other aspects? And so again, we are working on an implementation strategy currently, so you will likely hear more about that in the future, but we're working right now to inventory city programs and partnerships that align with elements of the index. And we'll develop a prioritization approach and present options to leadership and city council for their feedback. We'll also want to work with stakeholders in some of these areas to get their understanding of the opportunities and challenges that are there. Some communities have incorporated that part of the discussion into the upfront process of developing these type of tools. Given some of the challenges in collaboration during the COVID time period, we opted not to pursue that, but certainly we think that's very important. And then within the city, we certainly need to assign roles and responsibilities to ensure that this is executed and integrated going forward. And then I just wanted to close with a couple specific examples of how this tool might be used going forward. So one example actually where it's already being used is with this City of Trees Challenge, which is the community urban tree planting initiative being led by the Parks and Recreation Department in the city. And so they've used the tool and some of the tree canopy and urban heat island data to identify locations for specific neighborhood tree planting efforts, looking at the Liberty Park, Bora, and one of the other neighborhoods in that area, noticing those scored really low on tree canopy and high on urban heat island to prioritize some of their tree planting work. Additionally, with climate action, we see this as a great tool to prioritize location for our energy efficiency programs. You may have noticed that one of the data metrics was energy burden, or essentially households that have a higher level of energy costs than others. So that can be an area where we can work individually or with utility partners to target some of our programming. And then last, and this can very much tie to the work of Public Works and the Public Works Commission with utility affordability for our for our water renewal and waste management utilities, as we look for locations to potentially pilot affordability programs prior to rolling those out at a broad sense across the city. And so with that, we wanted to bring in the next discussion topic. And again, this has been touched on slightly in some of the earlier comments, but particularly given your knowledge of programs through Public Works, wanted to get some ideas if you had any thoughts about how we might utilize this tool across a range of Public Works programs and initiatives.
I have one thought that I'm still forming, and then I'll turn it over to the commission. I'm curious, in using this as a full city, what might be some of the opportunities and some of the boundaries, sort of the reciprocal relationship with the development of this tool and the development of new zoning code and land use patterns broadly in the city, as they are likely to impact one another over time. Does that make sense?
Chair, it does. I certainly won't claim to speak for our folks in planning and development services and the experts there on those particular matters, but I can share that we have made the availability of the tool to those teams as they work through their processes. Also, as we develop the tool, we found another really interesting resource, which is the city's Neighborhood Data Almanac. And it's interesting how much the work here aligns with that. And I suspect that there'll be a possibility to integrate this information into that work going forward and really, set it appropriately for use at that neighborhood scale and in a more tangible context, perhaps to residents across the city than presenting the data as we have here tied to the census tract boundaries.
Awesome, thank you. And I do wonder as well if it might be a good offer to provide this sort of high-level overview and perhaps some of the map and tools and definitions to members of the Zoning Code Rewrite Committee for their consideration as they're working through the process and engaging in more public outreach and engagement as well.
Chair, thanks for that comment. I'll defer specifics on that to the planning and zoning team, but I can certainly take that point of feedback to that staff.
Awesome, thank you. Commissioner Morgan.
Thanks, Chair. I had a question around how it can be integrated. I know that there was an equity lens and there were multiple examples of like how you went about that, but my question is formed around how are we incorporating Indigenous perspectives, since they are like knowledge keepers of this land and were prior to colonization. So I just wanted to see if we are including them in conversations as we think about how to implement some of the actions around the information that was gained.
Chair, Commissioner Morgan, I think there are, if we look back to let me start by saying, I think certainly the city, like many organizations, there is a journey, if you will, in terms of addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So, there are many steps. The climate team is part of those steps, I would suggest. If you look back to the climate action roadmap, we certainly didn't define what equity means, but we called out some particular actions and guiding principles as to what that is. And I think that speaks to input from groups that were typically underserved or voices that may not have always been at the table historically. So without maybe providing a specific answer, I think there are those opportunities as we move forward in implementation or taking feedback within some of those action steps that I identified currently. And I don't want to put Colin on the spot, but I don't know, Colin, if there's anything you'd like to offer from the community engagement perspective.
Chair, well, we might be tracking down Colin.
So apologies.
That's all right. Commissioner Morgan, I think it's a really good point you're bringing up, and frankly, it's one that we need to think more about. I think we've started to have some discussions internally on how we might do that, but we haven't landed on any specific kind of implementation tools or outreach. So I think it's an area of improvement, just to be very frank. Colin, did you have anything to add on that end? We cannot hear you.
Yeah. And I do appreciate that perspective. And I would just do a quick plug as well. For the remainder of the month, the application period is open for the remaining 2 seats on this commission. And so as you are engaging with your networks, that may be an opportunity to make some more targeted outreach and engagement and invitation to apply.
And Chair, are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, apologies for the technical glitches. Chair, Commissioner Morgan, really appreciate the question. And I think Steve addressed it very well. It's an area that we continue to improve on and work on, and I think there's more work to be done. So going forward, that's absolutely an area that we're looking at. How do we incorporate those perspectives into the work as we move forward? So just wanted to echo Steve. I thought they addressed it well, but very much appreciate the point and the question.
Thanks, Colin. As a follow-up, I would love to volunteer myself if you do need help forming those alliances. I'm happy to trailblaze and form those connections for the Public Works.
Chair,
Yeah.
Commissioner Moore, yeah, we will take you up on that, I promise. So more to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Commissioner Collette.
Sorry, I feel like I'm monopolizing, but I have lots of questions. So the 2 things that occurred to me is there any kind of incentive program that could be creative? So, once we find out that we've got certain areas and they're lacking certain things, what incentives could we create for businesses who go in and set up shop there and start, maybe it's a sliding scale of if they plant so many trees, they get, rebates or discounts on their bills, or, and the more they do, and specifically targeting, what's needed in that area, kind of the bigger the reward. And then secondly, is there some kind of program that sort of maybe recognizes like green standards for businesses, right? And so it's like a recognition program that the more effort these businesses are making, there's some kind of publicity or some kind of reward for them, an incentive for them to be able to do that.
Chair, Commissioner Collette, thanks for those questions. I'll take the second one first. There actually has been a lot of recent discussion concerning acknowledgement and kudos for those businesses who are pursuing climate-friendly opportunities. And we're in some discussions with some external partners about what something could look like in terms of a specific acknowledgement or certification or whatever word you might choose there going forward. So I think with a tease there, maybe more to come as it relates to that particular discussion. To the first part of the conversation, I think certainly all those ideas are on the table. There are some constraints in Idaho law on specific incentives that the city could provide down to the individual level, whether it be resident or business. So those are things that we'd have to keep in mind as those are developed. But at least at the conceptual level, those ideas are great to be contributed.
I wonder if there couldn't be some kind of partnership, though, especially if you're targeting, some of these more isolated areas, and it's going to be smaller businesses who are going there. If we could partner with, so maybe we're not legally allowed to give them a rate discount, but maybe we partner with a bigger donor, like one of the bigger, businesses in the valley, and there's some kind of more creative way to reward them, that we kind of get these businesses to work together or partner to incentivize them.
That Chair Commissioner Collette, that's a great suggestion, and certainly a lot of comments from the city recently have been to the nature of needing partnerships to solve these complex problems. So well noted. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And Commissioner Collette, I would also invite you to review Module 2 of the city's zoning code rewrite proposal. Some of the ideas that you've proposed remind me a lot of change number 4 listed on the executive summary that I will drop into the chat in the Zoom. But those are some new zoning incentives in exchange for energy or water saving improvements.
Awesome, thank you.
Yes. Commissioner Ellis.
Thank you for putting that in the chat, by the way. That's perfect. I wanted to tack on to what Commissioner Collette was saying. This makes me reminiscent of partnerships I've seen in the past. Clean water partners. I don't know if I have the right terminology, but almost like with each of the environmental aspects, like clean air partners, clean water, and there were these awards given out. And so now I feel like we've evolved to a multi-vector analysis where we're trying to put all together instead of just have these individual areas. So it's kind of a neat evolution seeing Boise come to. Yeah.
Chair Commissioner Ellis, yeah, thank you for the acknowledgement of those historical acknowledgement programs. I noticed the waste, I'm going to get the name wrong, but the waste and materials acknowledgement when I go into the co-op, it's there on the door, and I think it's been there for some time, but it's a fair acknowledgement. And I think, yes, a recognition of growth and broadening of these issues as we move forward.
Steve, would you go back a couple slides to the list of metric areas? Thank you. Just a sort of nomenclature note. Something that I'm thinking of in the framing of a clean city in the title of the project is the implicit opposite of clean in some of the need areas. And when we have things like low income and minority prevalence in some of these areas, I wonder what that might come across as just on the titular economic level. Just a note for consideration before this really goes live.
Yeah, Chair, I appreciate that comment. There's a ton of sensitivity communicating around this particular issue. I think those were printed just at face value as those metrics were taken from whatever sources they came from. But that's a very fair consideration. And it's interesting, I talked about how we kind of track some of the other cities developing their information. We had a chance to see a presentation from 2 other cities about their rollout, how they're using this in implementation. And it was really actually interesting to see the different perspectives, how each of the 2 cities kind of looked particularly at those 2 items in different areas. So good context for us as we move forward. And I appreciate you pointing that out.
Thank you. Commissioner Collette.
So just a comment on that I was kind of thinking that way as well. As we looked at the map and we saw the different colors, and when you have a really dark color next to a really light color, it helps to visually explain something, but it doesn't necessarily explain just how big the difference is. And so I wonder if we can communicate that as well. It's like sometimes you'll hear something in the news and they'll say, oh, crime has increased 300%. Well, if it's only gone from 1 crime to 3 crimes, it's really not that big a deal, right? But is there a way to kind of indicate that, okay, it's not from really bad to really good. Maybe it's just from okay to a little bit better, so it's not maybe it's not as drastic. And if we can communicate that so that the areas that are being underserved are not necessarily being represented as being absolutely awful.
Chair, Commissioner Collette, thank you. That's certainly been in the discussion hopper as well. Not only the difference amongst the data here in Boise across the different parts of the city, but also comparisons to the national average. For example, I'll point back to that air quality metric. Have seen a lot of questions about, how does that relate to national standards, for example, because, minus inversions and fire smoke, generally our air quality is good when you look at it nationally. And so we want to bring in some of those references as we move forward. And Chair, I'll do a time check just to be kind to the speakers that have to follow me, but looks like we may have time for perhaps one more question, if there is one.
Sure. Anything else from the commission or from our council liaisons?
No questions here. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Well, hearing none, then I think if you're all wrapped up, Steve, we will move on to the next item on our agenda. Thank you for introducing us to this project. I look forward to seeing it develop further. And the next item on our agenda is the Water Renewal Financial Plan Cost of Service Introduction. And I will turn it over to staff.
Chair Gravatt, thank you. This topic and the next topic are really just very high-level overviews for the commission to set up the more detailed discussions that are coming in the next several months. So didn't want folks to get too. It can be very technical and we're going to get a lot more detail in the future. We just wanted to introduce the topic, give you a sense for when we say cost of service, what does that mean? Again, we'll be having many more detailed discussions in the coming months. So I'll turn it over to Heather. Oh, I need to log back in on the PC. Hold on one second.
There we go. Good afternoon, Chair and Commission members. As Steve mentioned today, I'll give you a brief update on where we are with our financial plan process, and then also a little bit of very short update on where we are with our bond implementation for fiscal year 2022. So without further ado, we'll jump right in. Oh, if I can get the right button to work. There we go. So our financial plan process has 3 steps, and you've seen this slide before. Last year we used it to describe where we were as well. So there is a portion that we call revenue requirements, and then a cost of service piece and a rate design. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. It's just kind of setting up what those 3 large pieces are, and then we'll jump into the next few slides to describe each one. So a revenue requirement is taking into consideration how much revenue we need to operate our system. So it encompasses our capital plan and capital funding. So you've seen a variety of slides over the last few years showing our 10-year capital plan, and at times even our 20-year capital plan, so that we know how much funding we need to build the facilities that are required to provide services. And then we're also considering the capital funding, and I'll get to that piece in just a second. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, we also look at our operational costs. So we determine economic assumptions, kind of look at broadly at what's going on in the economy to make those assumptions for our funds and how they impact our funds. Then look at our individual operational costs, and then any debt service costs. And currently for our water renewal fund, we don't have a lot of debt service costs, but we will be rolling forward in the coming years with adding bonds to our financial portfolio. So that'll be included. And then we also overlay our general financial policies across that broad spectrum there. So that those three pieces come together to create our revenue requirement. And a lot of times you hear us referring to this as determining the size of the pie. So as we move forward, it kind of scales out how much of that revenue that we need to operate with. So for revenue requirements, we talked a lot to the commission about this last year, and it really went into developing that we needed to add bond financing into our financial portfolio, and led up to us asking voters in the bond election on November 2nd to approve adding that bond funding to our portfolio. So that approval that we received from voters allows us to add up to $570 million worth of bonds that could be issued over the next 10 years for our capital planning. So it also culminated into what we are determining as our overall utility rate trajectory for the utility of roughly 9.9% for the next several years. I'm only showing 3 years because that kind of aligns with our cost of service implementation, but it kind of set up that overall umbrella rate increase for the utility coming forward. So then if we consider cost of service, then that's taking the pie, so to speak, and slicing it amongst each of our different user categories. So we have residential users, we have what we call unmonitored commercial. So it's general businesses that we don't monitor their waste strength. So we call them unmonitored users. We do have monitored users where we actually go out and sample and monitor at their the constituents that are in their waste strength. And they also have wholesale customers. So we have 4 basic customer categories. So the objective of the cost of service is to recover the specific revenues from each of those customer classes based on what demand they're placing on the system. So if we step back from that, then how we accomplish this is taking all of our operational costs and we allocate those costs functionally to flow, biochemical oxygen demand, total suspended solids, phosphorus, and nitrogen. So we do that allocation to determine how much of our O&M costs go towards each of those different pieces. And then we look at each of our different user classes, or in some cases, individual users, but to determine how much of each of those items, flow, BOD, TSS, phosphorus, and nitrogen, how much of each of those pieces that that customer is using. So that intersection then determines how much it costs us to provide service to either a individual user or an overall user class. So as I mentioned a second ago, that's taking that overall pie and then we serve up a slice, so to speak, for each of those different user categories. So some users have a larger slice than others as we move forward. And it's been quite a while since we've done a cost of service study. So we know that the slices of pie or the sizes of those slices are changing as we move forward. So for different customer categories, they may be more or less than what they previously were based on, as we mentioned, the demands that they put on the system. So things that may impact on the changes in that cost of service. So as we consider what's been happening within our water renewal utility and our regulatory environment, we've added phosphorus treatment over the last 10 years or so. We're also changing and modifying how we treat for nitrogen, or so those are just a couple of examples. There are other things that are changing in our treatment process. We also may have increases in flow based on different user categories, or in some cases, we may be adding large users to our system that may change that impact. And so when you consider the combination of those things, there may be a change in proportionality, if I can say that, of the flow to the constituents that are in the water. And the constituents then are the BOD, TSS, phosphorus, and nitrogen. So if you consider, for example, on an individual household basis, as we've implemented lower flow fixtures and lower flow washer and dryers and so forth, it means that we may be using less water in our households, but what we're actually sending down the drain within that water is basically the same. So we end out with a higher concentration to the lower amount of water. So that changes and shifts that demand on the system for each user. So we're considering that, and we'll talk more about that as we present the cost of service impacts to you at one of the next meetings upcoming. So then the last piece of that then is incorporating the revenue requirements with the cost of service to determine our overall rate design. So it kind of layers the two of those together. So we'll go by each of the different customer classes and considering the policies that we have to generate the revenues, then we'll determine specific rates and adjusting the rates that we have right now to determine what we want to recommend to the commission for approval going forward. So one major change that we know we are going to be recommending, we currently have what's called a 3-rate or a 4-rate system. The 3-rate system includes flow, BOD, and TSS. The 4-rate system adds ammonia onto that. So we know that we need to add in phosphorus into that overall plan. So rather than having a 3-rate and a 4-rate system and then a 5-rate system, by adding phosphorus in, we're just combining everything and it will all be under a 5-rate system. At least that's what our recommendation would be. So that's being incorporated into our analysis that we'll also show to you in one of the coming months. So next steps for the financial plan, we are confirming revenue requirements. So last year we did that analysis on revenue requirements. We've had a year or so since then. We've updated our capital plan in the since that time. So we're making sure that the revenue requirements still hold as we expect. Our consultants are validating the work that we've done on that. So we'll check that box and make sure that we're all on board there. Then we'll be bringing back the recommendations that I mentioned to you related to cost of service and the rate design. So that'll be at one of our next meetings. So we'll review that with the commission and ask for your consent and approval of that. We're also starting to do some outreach with our large monitored customers and our wholesale customers, which would be the other sewer districts that we serve. So providing information and input, getting their feedback on the allocation process so that they can in turn impact their budget if they need to. And then last but not least on this portion of work would be incorporating the final rates that are determined and approved by the commission into our fiscal 23 budget that will get recommended to mayor and council. And one last piece of the overall financial plan is updating our connection fees. So what we've talked about so far is the allocation of costs related to our operational budget. Connection fees then does a very similar process, but related to our capital costs and determines a rate for a new customer as they connect to the system. So we're also doing that work and we'll bring that analysis back to the commission as well. So I'll pause there to see if there are any questions on process.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any questions from the commission? It does not appear so.
All right.
And so shall we move on to the bond issuance update?
Perfect.
Chairman,
Thank you. Oh,
Chairman, this is City Councilwoman Willits. I have a question.
sure. Yeah, go ahead. Councilmember Willits.
Thank you. I need some clarification on this. I want to make sure that I understand that our goal is to not raise rates any more than what was put out to the public as part of the bond election. Can you talk a little bit about that and when we'll be able to make that call? I saw some of it in the slides, but I'd like clarity on that, please.
Chair Gravatt, Councilmember Willits, thank you for the question. And that is a very interesting point. So the 9.9%, let me back up here. So this slide showed what that overall rate increase was for the utility as a whole. So that's kind of umbrella for the utility. When we are anticipating that we're doing our best to stick with that 9.9% proposal for fiscal year 2023. So that's the overall for the utility itself. When we start looking at the individual classes for each customer and overlaying that cost of service study that we're doing to achieve that utility level 9.9%, some customer classes may have a slightly lower rate increase and some customer classes may have a little bit higher rate increase than that. But when it comes together for the utility as a whole, the average would be that 9.9%.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And Chair Gravatt,
Yeah.
just a point of clarification, when we roll out the rate recommendations for FY23, the commission makes a recommendation to council just on the FY23 budget. We do like to show several years out what we're projecting. It's our goal to try to keep on those numbers for sure. There'll be some things that might be out of our control, inflation, construction costs, but if those deviate and there's reasons that we need either higher or lower rate increases, we'll provide that to both the commission and the council.
And Chairman Gravatt, one more question, may I?
Sure, go ahead.
When will we have a sense of whether any federal money can be used for this? I know that that was always a goal, but it seemed in limbo, and I'm assuming it's still in limbo.
Chair Gravatt, Councilmember Willetts. So there are several different ways we may have federal money to utilize in this, in the Water Renewal Fund. The first one that we're currently engaged in is the WIFIA loan program that's implemented by the EPA. So we've been approved to submit an application for that for up to $272 million of our overall bonding amount. So if you take that $570 million of bond authority, 272-ish million would be allocated in that WIFIA loan program. So that loan program is a great opportunity for the city. It generally has very low interest rates and very flexible terms so that we can utilize that as a really nice tool to try and keep rates as low as possible because of that flexibility. And then the differential, the other $300 million of bonds we anticipate to be through market issuance. And then there are also other programs related to the Infrastructure and Investment Act that we're also looking at of how the city may be able to receive some of that funding. We've been told that that may come through the state revolving loan fund. So we've submitted an application to that program as well. And we're always working with our legislative team to know what opportunities may come available to us so that we are on top of that to apply as needed.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you for that clarification. And with that, I think we're ready to move on to the next item, the bond issuance update.
Thank you, Chair. So this will be very quick then. So as I mentioned earlier, part of our process for the financial plan was determining that we would like to add bonding into our financial portfolio. We did ask the voters to approve that on November 2nd. It did pass with 80% plus of approval, which was fantastic. I already mentioned it allows us to issue up to $570 million of bonds over the next 10 years. So we will determine the $570 million does not get issued all at once. We look at our 10-year capital plan and determine how much additional funding cash that we need on hand as we move forward to pay for the different projects that we will be doing. So currently our plan assumes different issuances of bonds every 2 years. So right now we're working on that first issuance, and this first issuance will set up the framework that will allow us to move forward with future issuances in the coming years. So we may change up and we have flexibility. We could do issuances every 2 years or maybe 3 years. Looking at term, we're assuming right now in our financial plan a 30-year term. We may, as we're issuing, determine that for some things, a 20-year term may be better, but we're working through that process right now. So there are steps that we are going through, and this highlights some of the primary steps. I was chatting with one of my coworkers the other day, and there's a whole series of documents that we have to do. And if I listed them on the screen, it would be like 3 or 4 more slides. So, but this shows you kind of where we are. We're very early in the process. We had the bond authorization, and that's passed. We have recently selected our underwriter that will help us through the process of the issuance. So some of the next things we will be doing, we have to develop what's called a master bond ordinance. And that really is the city's framework of how the bonds can be issued, and kind of sets the boundaries for us. Then there will be, for this issuance in particular, a preliminary official statement, sizing of the bonds. We're considering what's called an EIB, or an environmental impact bond. So seeing how that may be incorporated, if mayor and council are willing to consider that. We have to be rated by the rating agency. So that's a step. And once we get, that's getting closer to that issuance time. So once we get there, we'll be finalizing the master bond ordinance and that preliminary official statement. And then we put information out to on the market for investors, letting them know that our bonds are available for sale, and securing pricing, and actually executing that final sale. So we are thinking that that whole process the culmination of that with the actual bonds being issued should be probably in the late April, maybe early May timeframe. We are considering flexibility of like when we may need the funds for this fiscal year. So we may allow that to push a little bit further out, but we're also trying to be aware that the sooner we do that, the likely better interest rates will be. So.
And then Chair Gravatt, just a couple of additional comments. Heather alluded, this first issuance will be our first tranche. The exact amount we're not 100% sure on yet. We're trying to figure out which projects ought to be included in the cost estimates, et cetera. To the question earlier about the bond amount that we have at 570, that's the upper limit of our bond amount. And if we can get access to grant programs, right? So if through the infrastructure bill, some of that funding comes through SRF, not just through loans, but also through grants, that just means that we'll be able to borrow less money, which is, long-term better for the fund. So that we got asked that question a lot during the prep for the bond election. Do you have to take out that amount? Not necessarily. It will depend on what other access, what kind of funding, what other funding we can access. For example, if there are grants out there, then will it be less than 570?
That is the end of my presentation. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to.
All right. Well, thank you. Are there any questions for staff?
Mr. Chairman, this is Councilwoman Willets. I had a question, but if there are commissioners that have questions, I'd like them to take precedent.
I am not seeing any right off the top, so take it away, Councilmember Willets.
Okay, so question on the financing. I suspect that interest rates will go up based on inflation. I'm not an economist, but I worry about that as a consumer. Talk to us a little bit about how this bonding works from a government perspective. Are there great variations in that bond rate? I'm just hoping we won't get caught in this this area where the money's going to cost us more based on what's happening in the market.
Chair Gravatt, Councilmember Willets, thank you for that question. You're right. Governments are not immune to the rate increases or rate fluctuations any differently than us as a personal, an individual consumer. So we are very aware of that. And with the WIFIA program that I mentioned, the nice thing about that program is that we can lock the interest rate in on that. But we don't have to start utilizing that funding source or that option for bonds until later on. It kind of puts a marker, so to speak, on that portion of the bonding that we will do. So we can know when we lock that interest rate in, we can hold for a while and do our market issuances earlier and try and get, like this year, we're trying to get our first issuance in before rates go up. So we are trying to do our best to mitigate those interest costs and being very cognizant about rates in the market. So we'll, do everything in our power to make sure that rates are as low as possible on all of our bonds that we will issue.
Thank you. I know it's an issue. Everybody's trying to race to see if they can get money before it goes up. So thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Well, hearing none, I would say keep up the good work.
Thank you, Chair.
All right, and then up next on our agenda is discussion on the recycled water community engagement. And I will turn it over to staff.
Thank you, Chair Gravatt. I don't typically like to refer to you all as guinea pigs, but in a way, you're going to be that tonight. This is really a presentation of kind of how we're going to start to engage the community on some very big picture recycled water program questions. If you recall, when we did our outreach on the utility plan over the 5-year window of that development of the utility plan, it was a 3-phase process. We started very big picture with the community and asked like kind of goalpost questions. How do you feel about drinking wastewater? How do you, and that narrowed it down to maybe a suite of alternatives. And then that next phase was a lot of surveys, focus groups around, okay, how would you feel about these combinations of projects? And then that led to the most kind of detailed granular phase was the advisory group of citizens that we really got into, here are portfolios of projects and costs, let us know your thoughts. And that was a 6-month process. So similarly for the recycled water program, we want to start kind of big picture, that kind of, that bigger phase of let's just talk about concepts. We want to hear from the public how they feel about recycled water. What are words that we would use that would resonate with you, that mean something, that it's not like engineering speak. So you'll see in this presentation, it's really big picture, but you are the first ones to go through the process. And so we're excited to see how it goes. And once we go through the process, we'd love your feedback on how it went and is there any refinements we can make to it, because then we're going to be pivoting external to the city as we roll out the program or the community engagement piece to key stakeholders. So with that, I will turn it over to Royce and Natalie.
Thanks, Director Burgos.
Yeah.
Should be on. Is it good?
Yep.
Chair, Commissioners, excited to go through this with you today about the recycled water program. So just wanted to reiterate from last week's presentation, just that we were very early on in this process with the recycled water program. Still have a lot of decisions to make, a lot of questions to answer. And this is just the very beginning stages of, collecting input from the commission, from the council, from the public, and then also collecting data, through our sampling and research. There are several phases of this outreach. This is really the first phase, and throughout the entire program, up until we have the first facility up and running, we'll be doing community engagement throughout the whole process, collecting information. And also definitely looking for the commission's input throughout this whole process as we go. And just to reiterate, we have the lanes of where we do our work in the program, the community engagement, the policy and partnership, land acquisition, the research with the pilot program, and then the permitting piece. So where we're putting our efforts, and tonight we're going to focus on the community engagement piece. So Natalie.
Okay, Chair, Commission. I know you went over this a little bit last week, but I just want to go into a little bit more detail about the community engagement that we have coming up over the next year. So this spring, we really are focused on getting input from our community. Like Steve was saying, we built the utility plan on input on our community's values to create something that was really reflective of Boise. And we want to make sure that we are continuing that process through the recycled water program. So this spring, we will be conducting focus groups. We'll go on a listening tour. We're doing stakeholder outreach, and then we're going to culminate all of that in a community survey and pull that together with a series of recommendations so that those values that we're establishing with the community can get integrated into these programs and these big decisions that we have coming up. Following that, we are going to be doing a lot of community education. We understand that recycled water is a little bit of a technical process. A lot of the things that we're going to be talking about are new to our community. And so we, especially as the pilot gets going, we'll be doing a lot of education to make sure that people understand what it is that we're talking about, what we're proposing, and how we're testing the safety of this whole process and of the water. We will be tying in with other initiatives. Recycled water is not happening in a vacuum. It has a lot of ties to other things that the city is doing, especially with our climate initiatives and various other programs. And so there will be a lot of tie-ins that you'll see. We won't be kind of standing this up all in a vacuum on its own. And then we're also discussing a future NWRI panel. So you may remember that this fall, we had the National Water Research Institute come out to conduct an independent third-party panel to really give us some information and some advice and recommendations about how we were getting this program off the ground, what our plans were to get launched. And so we'd like to bring them back and have them continue to be a third-party check on us. How are we doing? How is the pilot process going? How's our research going? To make sure that we're staying on track and really staying up to date with the science and having that as transparent as we can with the community. Our goals for this spring's outreach, we want to establish terminology for the program that resonates with the community. As Steve said, we get really technical really fast in public works. Engineers have a tendency to speak in acronyms. And there's just a lot of terms that we are sort of industry standard, but may not resonate very well with our community. So we want to make sure that the words that we're using are clear and that we can kind of establish understanding through our terminology. We also want to learn about our community's values about how we are using this recycled water. And we'll get more into that in a few minutes. And then we also are building a new facility. And as many of you may know, the West Boise facility that we have also hosts the Watershed Education Center. We think that is a really wonderful thing that we have as a community. And so we're open to figuring out what else we could be doing with this third facility. What opportunities are out there? What does the community hope that we are able to accomplish with that? Just a quick timeline. So as I said, this spring we'll be doing focus groups, which we will use to kind of hone in some of the questions that we're asking the broader community with the listening tour and the survey. We'll be doing stakeholder outreach starting this spring, but really ongoing throughout the whole program. And then starting this summer and fall, we'll be doing a lot of education and really trying to involve the community in what we're doing and what we're testing as much as people are interested to do that. Okay, so this next piece, I am going to ask you to do something a little bit new. As Steve said, you are a little bit my guinea pigs. I have used this with staff before, but not yet in a public setting. So you'll have to bear with me. But I would like to use the commission and council members that are on the call to really engage like a focus group, to really have a discussion around some of these questions that we have. And to do that, we are using Slido, which is a new, why is that not presenting? That's gonna be a problem. Hang on. Oh no. Yeah, but it's not popping up as if I'm presenting, which is going to make this not work. Yeah, let's see. I don't know how to.
Bear with us while we address technical difficulties.
Bear So it worked on Teams, but we're on Zoom now, so.
Oh. Yeah, Natalie just said that we test ran it on Teams, but not on Zoom. And that might be,
Should, I don't.
Well, our guinea pigs are off to a great start.
Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, man. Yes, I can do that one.
We're going to try to put a link in the Zoom chat. So hold on one second.
Chair Gabat,
Yes.
I just wanted to make Natalie feel better. I was just at a meeting yesterday where we all tried Kahoot at the end to quiz our knowledge of, did we listen well enough in the meeting? And there was a lot of technical back and forth. So it's all right. Look at that.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so yeah, the problem is that we won't be able to see the live results.
Did you just put it in the chat?
Natalie, should I try presenting from my desktop in Teams and you share the screen via Zoom? I know that's super workaroundy, but
Yes, let's try that. Thank you.
is your presentation in
Yes,
the iDrive?
it is.
All right, just give me a moment here.
Yeah, we tested a bunch of things, but we did not test on Zoom. So there you go.
And I will say that when it works, it works.
It's a great
That's
app.
really
I've used the
cool.
tool and I went to the inaugural zoning code rewrite meeting
Oh,
over at
yep.
the Hillcrest Library, and it was a really useful way to engage in that in-person meeting.
Kathy, were you able to find it?
I have it. It said that Steve had it open, so I went ahead and opened read only. Is that going to work?
Yeah, it should.
Okay, so, and then should I be in presentation mode?
Yes.
Hmm. One moment.
I appreciate everybody's patience.
Yeah. Okay.
While Kathy is working on that, I just want to reiterate that we really do value your input here. So also, if everybody could turn their cameras on so that we can feel like we're having a little bit more of a conversation. And please feel free to, even though we are using the Slido app, hopefully, or maybe just having a discussion, please feel free to jump in if you have questions, if you have comments. Again, this is really intended to be a discussion.
So I think I need to share my screen before I enter the mode. So let me just do that real quick.
Okay.
Sorry, I apologize. I have several things that are in the way of me grabbing the things, but I'm getting there. Okay. Can we see it?
No, we see a blank screen currently.
Super cool.
It looks like it's your screen to your laptop.
Okay.
We see your taskbar on the bottom. You can see it, you're toggling over your PowerPoint. All right, maybe we just.
Yeah, maybe we just
grab-
have, we can just have a
We
discussion.
go old school and
Yep.
just ask the questions and.
Okay, so the first question.
You have to speak in the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. The first question that I have that is a little clunky that I'm just going to have to read it out, but you guys are just going to have to bear with me. what term do you prefer for the water that we recycle? So as an introduction, a lot of the terms that we use, as I said, can be pretty technical. And we want to make sure that these are clear and understandable. I know that we have been talking quite a bit about recycled water, but that doesn't have to be what we call both the program and the product that we are creating. We are creating a recycled water product. And so for the water that has been recycled, we can call that recycled water. We can call it reclaimed water. We can call it purified water, advanced treated water, clear water, pure water. I think that's all my options. So is there a term that jumps out to you as something that it either adds to your understanding that this is very advanced, extra clean water that's not what goes to our regular system? Are there terms in there that detract from that? And just kind of have a discussion about what your preferences might be.
Sure, it looks like Commissioner Colette is ready to start us off.
I had an instant reaction. I think purified is the best because it implies that something's happened to it. So it's not just pure, people aren't being tricked, something has happened to it, but it's got a really nice clean connotation, because I think recycled, but when I hear recycled, I kind of think of, recycled garbage. And so I think purified to me definitely has the best ring without being deceptive.
Thank you.
Chair,
Yes, Commissioner Morgan.
I would like to second that. That was my first instinct when I heard purified. I thought that just sounded much more encouraging and much more palatable.
All right, and I put a few options that Natalie listed in the chat just for our reference. Yeah, and I do like the latter options, the advanced treated, clear, or pure.
Yep.
I like the focus on the end result rather than the process of reclaiming or recycling. I think that just sort of knee-jerk that draws me more to this is safe, effectively treated water, rather than questioning the process and letting my mind go off on that whole trail.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question? Oh, Commissioner Ellis.
Thank you, Chair Gravatt. I am having the same reaction. Even though I think you guys all know me, recycled and reclaimed is my jam. That's not what I think connotates for me. So yes, purified, advanced treated, filtered, all of those that imply that something has been done to the water to make it healthy, make it clean, make it safe. That's where you want to go.
Thank you. And Councilmember Willits said that she likes purified as well. And Councilmember Bajent asks, if we are giving this water a modifier, should we call the rest of it river water? I don't know if you want to hop off mute and clarify your question any further, Councilmember Bajent.
Yeah, it was kind of somewhat in jest, but if the point is that adding a word to this water causes people to think it's something other than water, which I don't think. I think the correct name for this is water. But I know that's not, that's not the issue we're facing. Then maybe part of what we should do is be clear about where the rest of the water comes from and what it is, so that there's not a perception that, well, you have water and then you have this other thing that Public Works is selling, and it's processed water, or whatever word we use could still cause those misassociations to be used.
Chair, council member, sorry. That is a really interesting point, and I think that is something that we'll definitely take into consideration and bring into our discussions. Appreciate that. Any other comments?
Commissioner Ellis.
Thank you. I want to tack on to what Councilmember Bajent just said. I remember being on the Water Advisory Board a couple of years ago, maybe it was more than a couple of years ago. And I remember Steve mentioning One Water, this whole idea of having to communicate one water. So I wonder where we are on that, this idea that we may have to come forward with this purified water, explain river water, but there's this idea of one water. Where has that idea gone?
Chair Gravatt, I can chime in. Thanks, Commissioner Ellis. It's, part of the recycled water program. Maybe it'll be the purified water program soon. It's really a part of that broader water resources strategy. John Roldan was with the commission, it was 3 or 4 months ago, where he just presented on some of the bigger picture water strategies that we're moving forward with. Our intention is to view all of those strategies as our one water strategy. So there'll be an irrigation water component, there'll be a recycled water or a purified water component, there'll be a drinking water component. But the idea is that we're trying to get an overarching water management strategy, and that all of those pieces are going to interact in ways that we haven't considered in the past. And so if that's answering your question, Commissioner, it's going to come back to kind of John Roldan and his part of Public Works, where he's looking at the strategic water resources management and how we see those different types of water interact to try to break down some of those silos so that it is considered just one water. So that's part of his work. We'll have more coming. We have lots of ideas on that John's working on that will be back in front of the commission, but that's kind of where we are on the concept.
Yeah, and some of this conversation is making me think as well of two sort of similar tracks. One is getting ahead of some misinformation. I think that if we don't qualify the water, then that might leave a wider opening for some misinformation about the level of treatment and the level of care and the dynamic response to pollutants that we are taking into consideration in our water treatment. And then the next level of that is that this is a really advanced and really impressive and innovative approach to water that I think that the people of Boise have indicated their support of. And I think that if we can narrow down a modifier that really resonates with us, it could be an opportunity for us to build a sense of pride in this new water investment and bring sort of the utility services, this public service that the city provides really, really effectively and efficiently out of sort of the only interface that we get with our water services or with public works generally is when something doesn't work, right? Could be something that we are invested in and building upon.
Terry, I really appreciate those comments. Thank you. Okay.
It looks like Colin has his hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, Chair, Commission members, I also just wanted to add on that part of the One Water discussion is a lot of the way that the watershed currently talks and educates currently about that we only have one supply of water on the planet. And so, as we go forward, that's going to continue to evolve. But the watershed has already done really good works about talking with young people, talking with visitors to the watershed about that one water concept. So just wanted to add that on, that they're already doing a very good job of that work.
Awesome. Yes. Shout out to our watershed team.
Okay. Unless there are any other comments on the recycled water versus purified water, I'm going to move on to our next set of terms. Because we've been calling it recycled water this entire time, I'm going to continue calling it recycled water through the rest of the presentation, but that does not mean that I did not hear all of your comments and appreciate them. I just don't want to switch course midstream. So the next question I have is, what term do you prefer for putting the water back into the aquifer? So we have been calling it aquifer recharge. There is also, we could call it aquifer replenishment. We could call it groundwater recharge. We could call it groundwater replenishment. Or if any of you have a different idea, we're also open to those. But are there any of those terms that speak to you or feel like they detract from kind of what we're shooting for here?
Could you list those terms one more time?
Yep. Aquifer recharge, aquifer replenishment, groundwater recharge, and groundwater replenishment.
Awesome. Thank you. Commissioner Collette.
I like groundwater replenishment. I think it's the most straightforward and easy to understand and what most people would be able to relate to.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ellis.
You asked if any of those detract, and no, they all, I think, are really good ones. And then I just think too, between aquifer and groundwater, I think more people will get groundwater. You'll hit more people understanding that one right away.
Chair, Commissioner, thank you.
And it looks like Commissioner Morgan seconds what Commissioner Collette said. Commissioner Ellis, did you have another comment? Okay. Councilmember Bajan.
Is one of the terms more like technically accurate? Groundwater and aquifers, maybe they're the same, maybe they're different, but is one of them, I see Steve bobbling his head back and forth, so maybe it's not a different. Or maybe there's a really long answer. I don't know, but yeah, is there an answer?
I'll defer to Steve.
Chair, council member, it's a good question. I don't really know if I'm trying to think of if there's really a technical difference. And you can start slicing and dicing. There's the shallow aquifer, there's the deep aquifer. I think groundwater is probably the catch-all for now that we could most people would relate to. So it's a good comment, but technically we'll look into it. I think that's an interesting, is there a very technical issue that we ought to use one over the other? I don't know. That's the head bob.
Chair Gravatt, just a quick follow-up.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, in that case, I mean, I really like groundwater because everybody, intuitively understands it. And then there's also an ooky part of me inside that somehow feels like don't mess with the aquifer, or don't accidentally inject things into the aquifer. Or there's this kind of scary feeling because aquifer seems bigger and more permanent, even though the data is proving they're not permanent at all. It kind of feels that way, whereas groundwater feels safer somehow.
Chair, Councilmember, thank you for those comments.
All right. Any other questions or comments?
All right, I'll move on to the last terminology question. So another component of the program, as you heard from Royce the other night, is that we are discussing taking the water that we recycle or purify or advanced treat and sending it back to industry. So we have a couple of options for that process. We could call that industrial reuse, which is the term that we have been using. We could also call that commercial reuse, industrial water recycling, commercial water recycling, or again, open to any suggestions if there's something that kind of jumps out at you.
All right, initial thoughts. I like the commercial framing. I think that industrial does sound more heavy on the pollution end, sort of like industrial zoning, industrial use, gives the impression of being surrounded by big oil barrels and that sort of thing. So I like commercial reuse would have my vote. Commissioner Collette.
Yeah, I would agree. I think commercial is also just a better catch-all. Industrial seems very specific. Commercial just applies to anyone who's not residential.
Chair, Commissioner, thank you.
Other thoughts? All right, I'll take that as seeming that we're all sort of on the same page there.
Okay. And I am going to lean on Kathy a little bit for this next one. Kathy, I'm hoping that you can, well, you can't because you can't see the slide. Yeah. In here. Okay. Okay. Yep.
Working through a few more technical things on this end.
This next one just has a lot of options for me to list off, so it would be a lot easier if everybody could.
Natalie, can you just go to slido.com and type in the the number, the code, and or could everybody do that?
Yes, I am working on logging in now. Engagement. I think that it should not show, but you're gonna have to watch me. This is a department-wide one, so it's gonna take me a second. Okay. Let's see. I wonder if I can just do what Kathy said and just go to the, yeah.
Could we just type them out in the chat? Would that be quicker?
Yeah, maybe. Okay, so the next kind of section that I want to talk about is the uses of what we're doing with this water. So one of the main components of this new program is to put the water that we clean into the aquifer. And so the specifics of where we put the water, how we get it to the aquifer, and how it benefits the aquifer are all questions that we're still working through. So that said, we want to understand a little bit about your understanding of the aquifer and what your priorities are for what happens to the water through this program. So thinking about the potential benefits to our community, I was going to have you rank order these, but maybe I'll just list them out and we can just talk through any of these that jump out at you as kind of your most important value, what you're really hoping that we can gain, maybe top like 1, 2, or 3. So in no particular order. So we have economic developments, we have financial benefits, so the city making a profit from the recycled water, replenishing our drinking water supply, drought mitigation, so storing water for future drought conditions, flood mitigation, so creating an outlet to help control flooding, increasing the city's access to water rights, diversifying our water supply, program flexibility, so allowing for the program to pivot to address emerging needs, protecting the Boise River, and climate resiliency, so mitigating some of the climate impact to our valley's water. So I know that that was a lot, and I think Haley is working on putting them in the chat for you, but are there any of those that really jump out at you as priorities that really resonate with you? Sure.
Commissioner Collette.
I'm sorry, I'm always one of the first opinions. I think people will really resonate with protecting the Boise River. I think it's just the pride and joy of Boise, and people will really get behind that.
Chair, Commissioner, thank you. Other thoughts?
Other thoughts for what? Commissioner Ellis.
I apologize. I can't retain all of them. I just need to hear them again or see them.
If you open up the chat, you can see them.
Okay. I don't see it in the chat.
Right at the bottom.
Okay, yeah, let's see. There we go. I didn't scroll all the way to the end. Sorry.
Chair.
Yes, Commissioner Morgan.
I also agreed with Commissioner Collette, but I would also like to add that like I'm a sustainability nerd. I get really geeky on it. So I really like the term climate resiliency because that's something that I want to hear cities commit to personally. So I think that would speak to other like sustainability nerds who are hoping for more from their cities on climate change adaptations.
Chair, Commissioner, thank you.
Chair Gravatt, I have another opinion. I think we should avoid saying financial benefits. I think it has a bit of a negative connotation. I think when we're talking about water and the protection of water and the protection of our resources, we should steer away from that in the conversation.
Chair, Commissioner, I appreciate that comment. I would ask, could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that? Not that I'm questioning you. I think that's a really interesting concept, and I'd like to just learn a little bit more about kind of what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, and obviously it's just an opinion, but I think when you think of, if I were to put myself in the position of just the average person, and you don't really have all the background information, and you kind of just hear bits and pieces of these programs, I think, especially now, there's just so much mistrust in government and politics, and finances are so often tied into that. So even just bringing that thought into the conversation, to me, feels like just a tricky area where there's so many other positive things that you can say. That's just my gut reaction to it.
Chair Commissioner, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and my feelings are similar to Commissioner Colette's. Any sort of framing or advertised benefit of this direction that is more internal to the functioning of municipal government, I think is already sort of a degree removed from the way that most people engage in the community broadly. So tying it more specifically to things that people can go and see and experience, or have more of a sense of connection with, like the Boise River, like potentially climate resiliency and economic development. I think those are, and drought mitigation, those are sort of the top line for my sense.
Right, because I think unless people are feeling a direct, impact on the rates that they're paying, which they're not going to in this instance, then what's the point of even bringing it up?
Chair Commissioner, I appreciate your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Other thoughts or questions?
Okay, well, I will jump into our next question, which is just an open-ended question for discussion, but what is it that excites you about the idea of aquifer recharge or groundwater replenishment?
All right, and I will open it up. Commissioner Colette.
I think the thought that people who live in Boise, I think, are so proud to live in Boise. If you're from Boise, you're proud to be from here. If you moved here, you're so glad you got here. And it feels like it's a way that we are proactively giving back and taking care of this land that's been taking care of us. I just really like that feeling.
Awesome. Chair Commissioner, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioner Ellis.
Thank you. I agree with what Commissioner Collette just said. And again, thinking of it as like a bank account, this idea that we're taking care, saving, being conservative. Even thrifty was a word, just the idea that you're being really good to save for the future. So that's what gets me excited about it, that we're actually taking care.
Thank you. Commissioner Morgan.
Thanks, Chair. I would like to echo what Commissioner Collette had said, but I would also just really, my emphasis would be more along the lines of like, yes, we're giving back to the land. We have taken so much from the land, and now we're having an opportunity to give back to this earth that has built so much, that has a beautiful community on it, that just is grounded in so much diversity as well. So that's where my thoughts go, is like what we're giving back to this incredible land that we get to be on.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead, Commissioner Ellis.
You just made me think regenerative. I think that resiliency has been a really popular term. And actually the first time I heard it was at the Water Advisory Board. And then I just started an environmental consulting business called Resilience, because I couldn't get over how great that word was. And now I'm hearing the word regenerative, which goes with what you just said, Commissioner Morgan. The idea that we have the ability to be regenerative is amazing.
Great.
Yeah, and I'll add sort of a different angle. What excites me in the sense of not like really energetic and enthusiastic about, but more just a heightened sense of excitement, is looking at what's happening to surrounding aquifer systems, looking at the communities over by Mountain Home and the decline in their aquifer systems. This is an opportunity for us to play a more active role in ensuring the longevity of our water supply, almost as a public safety element to our water plan, ensuring that our aquifers don't deplete.
Chair, thank you.
Other thoughts? Commissioner Morgan, do you still have your hand up?
All right, well, I will jump into our follow-up question, which is what questions do you have about aquifer recharge? And I'll put a little caveat on this. I'm not going to answer all of your questions now. I don't have all the answers now, but just so that we know kind of what questions and concerns are kind of top of mind for you about all of the planning and all of the programming we have coming forward.
All right, oh yeah, Royce, go ahead.
Sorry, Chair, I have a question that I'd like to ask. I just want to know, what do you consider our aquifer? That's my question. I heard that comment a few times, and I'm just curious what you consider our aquifer.
Sure, and this is just the sort of the conversations that I've had as I've gone out and sort of in response to some recent news coverage about the mountain home area, their water systems, and the state of the aquifers more toward that way, understanding that they're all actually connected, but just as a response to that sort of headline coverage. So it's more a municipal water supply system that is being projected onto aquifer as a result of that news coverage, if that makes sense.
Chair, thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate that clarification.
Yeah. Any other questions top of mind? Commissioner Ellis.
I think, again, I don't expect you to answer this, but I'm trying to reflect upon when I keep going back to this water advisory board group that I was on. There were all those questions of, that there are some aquifers that were lower than others. There's how do you get it there? What kind of goals do you have of, thresholds of how much you want to recharge it to? So there's all of these technical questions I remember discussing. And I don't know if that will ever be something you have to get to for the wide audience, but there's going to be some people that want all those particulars. But that's just what's coming to mind. I can't actually say I know where they are. I would just say they're somehow connected to our watershed. I couldn't say exactly where they are, though, to answer Royce's question. That's the input I have so far around
that.
Chair, Commissioner, I appreciate that question. And I definitely think that aquifer education and groundwater education is going to have to be a really big part of our outreach. I think even as staff, we are learning a lot every single day. And this first portion will be exploratory, but I absolutely echo what you're saying. I think that there is a lot for that education piece. And Chair, I think there might have been a couple of questions in the chat.
Yes, Commissioner Morgan has two questions in the chat. First, how does the process of recharging the aquifer work?
Great, thank you. I will not answer that, but I will appreciate that question and I will note it.
Yeah, an upcoming course from the Boise Watershed Education Center. And the second question is there a certain optimal level that the aquifer should be at?
That's a great question. Again, I don't know, but
It's
noted.
Yeah, follow-up course from the Boise Watershed Education Center. Any other questions that come to mind?
I have a question. So we're talking about replenishing the aquifer, but are we needing to decontaminate it all? Is that an issue for us?
That is a great question. Thank you.
And
I will note that it feels strange for you to ask questions of me and then for me to just nod and say good question.
A question that did come up at the Zoning Code Rewrite Committee public meeting earlier this week, up from some neighbors up toward the airport end of the bench neighborhood. Was part of the presentation in that module 2 was reducing the parking requirements, and that's an opportunity for groundwater recharge as more lots have more permeable space. So broad question, what are the dynamics of that in relation to the water renewal plan?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Appreciate bringing that up.
Other questions or comments?
All right, well, I will move on to our last 2 questions. So moving on to the new facility. So as I said, we're going to be building a new facility that will recycle water. And we are hoping to be a good neighbor and a resource to our community. And so if you lived or worked next to this facility, what would be important to you and what questions would you have?
I will open it up. Commissioner Collette, kick us off.
Specifically, and I'm sorry if this is a stupid question and I should know this, but specifically what water is being recycled?
Yep, that's a great question. So right now we are looking at recycling industrial water. So water that is coming from industrial sources. It's not municipal. So there's no toilet flushing going into this water. It'll be water that was used by industries in some industrial process.
So there's potential chemical contamination.
Yes. And that is all stuff that we will be testing for. We're doing source water characterization now, I think as Royce mentioned last week, to test what is in that water so that we can have a better understanding when we get to the pilot testing phase of what treatments are required to remove those.
Yeah, I would piggyback that's such a huge part of this whole program, is to really understand, Natalie alluded to it, the wastewater characterization, i.e. what is in the water we're going to take in. And then we're going to be testing different technology, all kinds of different technology on how do you remove it to meet the specific standards for the state DEQ has for Class A recycled water. So that's going to be such a big part of the first couple of years before we make any decisions on what this thing's going to look like and where it'll be, and what technology. All the pilot tests is going to lead to those decisions. So the pilot testing is going to be a critical part.
And I think just in terms of just to carry on, to answer the question about, being a good neighbor, I think being really, really, really communicative about letting people know that if this contaminated water is being brought into their area, that it's not going to affect them at all. It's not going to contaminate any of their sources or the land that they're on.
Chair Commissioner, that's a great comment. Thank you.
A preliminary clarification for this question that may be in a larger presentation that you might have is right now there's no site selected for this third facility. So we don't know what land use around it will be, who the neighbors are, anything like that. So this question is meant to inform that future decision.
Correct. Before we acquire the land, we want to know what concerns people will have, what neighbors might be concerned about. And also to the next question, if we're looking at putting amenities other than just recycling water, how big of a parcel do we need to be looking for? So yes, this is all very preliminary right now.
Okay. And I wonder if in the community engagement approach, it might elicit more usable feedback to split this into a few different questions. So if it was closer to maybe some more residential or mixed use land, what sort of amenities would we like? If it's closer to more industrial zoning, farther from where people usually live, work, and play, what amenities would make more sense there versus if it's out in the middle of nowhere, what might we want to see?
Great. I appreciate that. Thank you, Chair.
Commissioner Collette.
Yeah, sorry, I have a question based on that. So, if we're saying that this is going to be industrial water that we're reusing, where are the primary sources coming from? I mean, surely if we're having to transport this water, that infrastructure costs a lot of money. So we'd want to make sure that the facility is close to wherever the water is coming from, or is it just coming from so many sources that it doesn't really matter?
Yeah, I think that we can broadly say that we are looking at Southeast Boise and the various industries that are out in that area. So the facility, while we don't have a site selected, I think broadly we are looking at that general area of town.
Gotcha.
Yeah, Commissioner Collette, it's such a good point because, yeah, you don't want to put the facility 10 miles away from where the supply water is. So we're going to try to be as good as we can to try to minimize costs. But at the same time, we want to balance that with the expectations of the community. So generally speaking, we're looking at the southeast portion of the city. Yep. So think like south of 84, east of the airport is a general location potentially.
And so maybe to sort of kind of spur the conversation and to kind of round it out a little bit, in addition to any questions or concerns, if you could have any amenity you wanted, sky's the limit, no budget, just if you could have whatever you liked on this facility, what would you hope to see? So some examples, like, would you hope to see a community gathering space like a park or a conference center or a some sort of connections to other pathways in the community? Really, sky's the limit. If you could do whatever you want, what would you do here?
Yeah, and a lot of the pie in the sky thoughts that I've heard are things like a community garden, library or educational space, Boise Watershed Education Center too. Yeah, things like that. Public art as well, making sure that it's not an eyesore, something that people would want to walk by and see and engage with in a myriad of ways.
Those are great ideas. Thank you, Chair.
Commissioner Collette.
I don't know how feasible or practical it would be, but like I ultimately think, Boise is such a family-friendly place, and so trying to get families in. So like I immediately go to like a pool or a water park, and then you've kind of got this captive audience because parents are bringing their kids, and then you've got people of all different ages there. It could be a nice draw. And I don't know that. I mean, do we have? I suppose we do have. We've got an auditorium in Southeast Boise, but.
We'll have the first pure water pool.
Right?
We'll bring in the geothermal strategic plan as well.
Chair Commissioner, thank you.
Yeah, Commissioner Ellis.
I like that idea, Chair Collette, because I kept thinking, well, like, how could we bring it back to water? And I just, I did not think of the theme park, but that's where my mind keeps going. How do we bring it back to water, environment? I don't know. I'm still noodling on it, but to me, that would be my thought: is how do you bring it back so that it shows that we're trying to walk the talk, and we're making it visible. And
right, like I think of where and I forget the name of the park, but right at the base of Lucky Peak, you've got the big Keep Your Forest Green, and then you've got the park there and the water and the maybe tying it into that somehow, something like that.
Great.
And building on some of this, more from a utilitarian standpoint for the city, are there facilities that could be consolidated to space that it would make sense to have another annex, City Hall Southeast, or a collection of office space that might result in some long-term cost savings as we do get rid of some of our smaller parcels throughout the city to make way for other uses?
Chair, that's a great point, and I think ties in really well to some of our climate initiatives and transportation goals and things like that. So I appreciate that.
Commissioner Ellis.
Okay, now the ideas are starting. So this idea of, I think of locations and buildings sometimes being a teaching tool. So the actual location itself could be instrumental in like rainwater capture and pervious landscaping, all these kinds of ways people could do a better job of being conservative with their water use. and I know that we've got the watershed there, but it could be more along the lines of like actual examples at your home that you could exemplify there in an outdoor space.
Chair, Commissioner, that's great. Thank you.
Awesome. Let's continue the design sprint. Any other thoughts?
Okay.
Right, not seeing any right now, but I'm sure more will pop up in the middle of the night.
All right. So that is all the questions I have for you. I would like to thank you so much for bearing with all of our technology problems. Nothing is quite as humbling as walking into a presentation that just doesn't work. But I still think that we had a really great conversation here. I think that this has been very valuable, and even your input has been very different than some of the conversations that we have around the technical table. So it is refreshing to start to daylight some of these questions and have conversations with our community. And so I really appreciate you bearing with us because I think that we got some really great information from you. And you will see us again.
We're looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Is there anything else? No. All right. So I will bring up one more item that didn't make it to the agenda, but I will ask Director Burgos to share the stage with me to introduce a concept that we've sort of touched on in previous meetings. But to set the stage, as we are looking at the size and scope of some of the work that the city is tackling right now with some of our major initiatives, we are looking for more ways to engage the public, more ways to bring diversity of experiences and perspectives to the table, to make more informed decisions and really look at how cross-disciplinary and how big some of these major projects are. And so to effectively tackle some of these large areas, we are exploring the idea of forming subcommittees through this commission. And specifically, there are two areas that have arisen as priorities for us to make sure that our next steps are as effective and impactful and inclusive as possible. And so these are sort of two initial proposals for subcommittees that we can discuss as a commission broadly. The first subcommittee that we would propose would be to support the climate action work. Given how everything is sort of impacted by the sort of the changing climate over time, we need to bring in a lot of perspectives and a lot of partners to really make the most effective decisions that we can. Similarly, as we have a major project underway with our water renewal utility plan and our recycled water programs, it would behoove us to make sure that the investments that we are making, the major investments that we're making, are made with an eye toward the broad public interest and the most effective, equitable, and inclusive procedures, processes, and methods of engagement. So I will turn it over to Steve if you have any other angles that I missed in introducing the broad topic of subcommittees.
Yeah, Chair Gravatt, that's great. And just some historical perspective, the commission did have in years past subcommittees that were more focused on kind of specific project areas. So for example, when we cited the 20 Mile South Farm, that's our biosolids application site, that was a very intense process that we decided to go ahead and form a subcommittee around so we could get feedback and get some commissioners who were going to take a deep dive with us, but then could go back to the larger commission and share what they were learning and recommend, you know, this issue has been turned upside down in every which way. We feel good that it's, you know, this is the right direction. So when I think about like water renewal, I mean, we just have some major investments that are coming. And I also, what appeals to me is just the transparency. the ability to share with a subcommittee more detailed information. Frankly, if we tried to get all the information that we work on, not that because we're superheroes or anything, but there's just a lot going on and we can't really delve into it as deeply as we might want to in these meetings. We just don't have enough time. So we were hoping with the subcommittee that we could get into some of those more detailed discussions on water renewal, maybe some more technical discussions, and certainly on the financial side, just vetting some of the ideas that we have, how we're going to move the processes forward. And on climate, the chair alluded to it, we have so many different initiatives that fit under climate, whether it's energy, the big picture water management, that one water concept, solid waste program, trash recycling, composting, those all can fit under climate action. So we thought that might be appropriate as well. We have some pretty audacious goals around clean energy and carbon neutrality. So we're going to need the community and the subcommittee to help us navigate some of these really challenging issues. Because specifically on climate, there's just no way the city government is going to solve that one. We will play a key role, but certainly the community, we need them engaged in helping us come up with some of those solutions.
So broadly, the subcommittee's goals would be to gather more information and more perspective and input related to the broad topics that they cover, and provide reports and recommendations to this body for further deliberation and decisions to pass along as appropriate. So before jumping too deep into any of the technical details, and before gathering your specific interest in any particular direction, what are your overall initial thoughts on this approach to these major projects? Commissioner Morgan.
I would really love to see these subcommittees formed. I feel like it would provide that deeper level of analysis and be able to understand levels on a more intimate level. So I have been in favor of this because I do want to be involved, but sometimes some of the topics like finances are not really something that I have a good knowledge base in, but something else that I do have a stronger knowledge base in. I would love to be able to dive deeper and be able to provide more perspective to the commission.
Perfect. Thank you. Any other questions, comments, concerns, or threats about this top level concept? Commissioner Ellis.
I'm wondering if we're thinking we would then be meeting outside of the working meeting, so then it would be a separate subcommittee meeting, or is this something where we're given material to read on our own and then report back? We're just wondering if there is a rough cut on that structure yet.
And that level of detail currently is undetermined. I imagine that it may be similar to the way that we conduct these meetings, a combination of both, a combination of materials to review beforehand to get a broad perspective, and then as appropriate, receive presentations, materials, and discussion from experts in staff and other community members who may be invited to participate in the subcommittee. Commissioner Collette.
I'd be interested in knowing which other subcommittees would potentially be coming afterwards, because I don't want to spread myself too thin and make promises I can't keep, but I'd be hesitant to commit to something up front, but then, maybe 2 months down the line, something else comes on that maybe I really have a lot of expertise in that I would really rather be on. So what does that look like?
Chair Gravatt, I can jump in. The chair and I talked about some other topics that could be included in the future. One would be the arts, the Public Works Arts Master Plan, if I can spit it out. I think that one stands out as that's a no-brainer. We're just not ready to do that just yet. We have a new arts director. We have a new arts lead for Public Works. So there's things we've got to get organized around. So that one jumps out to me. Certainly community engagement, just like how best do we do that as a Public Works department? We are trying to really change how we interact with the public. For so long, we were just kind of like head down, just do your work. And if nobody's calling to complain, that's good. We just can't be that way anymore with the scale of projects we're taking on. So community engagement was something that the chair brought up that he would like to see in the future. We thought we'd start off with these two first, but, and frankly, we could solicit ideas if you have perspectives you'd like to share.
Yes, absolutely. And I would also note that similar to this body, service on a subcommittee would be voluntary and dependent on your interest and availability. And there was a second half to that thought that I just lost, but I will open it up for any further feedback that you have on subcommittees in general, those two topics, and maybe any other input that you have on other ideas for things that we should tackle.
I think I would need some time to think on it.
What was that?
I think I would need a bit of time to think on it.
Sure. The second part of the thought that just came back is that the exact scope and direction of these subcommittees would be determined by this body. So we would be able to outline sort of the expectations and duties of subcommittees as we see fit. And so we could outline expectations for particular members of those subcommittees. Should a subcommittee have a chair and a secretary to report back and coordinate with staff and other community partners to set up meetings and gather further information for report back. And should we engage other community partners to just come to the table and provide their input and thoughts on materials that are presented. And choosing those, the two topics that we brought top of mind are really because those are some pretty timely materials and some pretty large investments that the city is taking in the next couple of years. So diving a little bit more into the weeds, the who, what, where, when, why, how, the who, as I understand it, and we can receive further clarification if I should get anything wrong as we engage with the topic further. The membership of any subcommittee would be subject to the same terms of engagement on this body. So they would have to be residents of the city of Boise. And we could make particular notes to engage particular segments of the city of Boise, whether that is industry, nonprofit, education, neighborhood, et cetera, to make sure that we are engaging perhaps with some perspectives that we do not currently have strongly represented on this commission. The topics we could, in the formation of our subcommittees, request report back and engagement and investigation on particular topics throughout the year as a part of our direction to those subcommittees. And yeah, Director Burgos.
Chair, just something you had brought up, which I thought was a really interesting idea, was having other commission members across the city maybe be part of one of these subcommittees. So maybe you have a planning and zoning commissioner that could sit on a water renewal subcommittee. That would be an interesting perspective. The one of just kind of the I guess technical issues is we don't have an intention to have these as public meetings that have to meet the public meeting law. So we would have two commissioners on each of the subcommittees, in part because it starts to become a pretty big burden on staff to do the meet all those requirements. And second, we do just want to have more conversations on these particular topics. So it wouldn't be our intention to have these as public meetings, but the report outs would all be, public records, and certainly the primary commission meetings would be still recorded, all the same logistics.
Yes, and these subcommittees are not necessarily designed to be functional in perpetuity. So we could bound them to a single year of service and then revisit the subcommittee after that year to sort of hone further the the size and scope of any particular subcommittee in service of those particular ends.
And just acknowledging, this may not go well. We don't know how this is going to go. We're hoping it will because we want the feedback. But if it's not working, we're not just going to keep doing it. So we'll be working with the chair to make sure we're doing as best we can, that these are functional and providing good feedback for us and also for the public to be able to ask questions for the members of the subcommittees. So yeah, it's going to be a little bit of adjustment as we go along, and we're going to be tweaking it as we go.
Awesome. So I'll open it up for any other questions, comments, concerns, or threats from anybody present to help hone any next steps that we would take on the formation of these subcommittees. Yes, Commissioner Ellis.
I'm excited to hear what the subcommittees are. Oh.
That's up to us. Awesome. As we are out engaging with our networks, I think that it would potentially be a good idea to float by anybody to see what the public perception of this next step toward public engagement and direction would be. How it would be received from the people in our networks and the people that they know, hopefully. And I'll keep my email inbox open for any ideas that you have on these. And I'd particularly like any input, advice, and counsel from our council liaisons in the future as well. Director Burgos.
Sure. Something I forgot to mention was the chair and I talked about the size of the subcommittee, and we both agreed we didn't want it to be too large because if it gets too large, it just gets unwieldy. So we were thinking between 5 to 9 folks, including the two commissioners, something that was small enough that you could have really meaty conversations and good back and forth. So that's kind of another thing that I wanted to note.
Awesome. So that is a broad, high-level proposal for our further consideration. If this sounds like a positive direction, just give me a thumbs up. If it sounds like something that we should continue to explore, looks pretty well received across the board. So thank you. I think our next steps will be to further refine some of the more technical procedural components, getting that started up. For further discussion at one of our upcoming meetings on the full scope and direction of these subcommittees and advice on recruitment for those subcommittees. And potentially putting together some language for a motion for the formation. Am I missing anything in that discussion? All right. Well, are there any other last questions, comments, concerns, or threats? Anything else to come before the commission? All right. Seeing nothing, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Chair.
Yes, Commissioner Morgan.
I entertain a motion to adjourn. Or I make a motion to adjourn.
All right, we have a motion. Do we have a second?
I second it.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, the same sign? Hearing none, the motion carries and we are adjourned. Thank you all for your attention, for your engagement, and happy Friday Eve. I'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
For the record, could you tell me who was the second on that motion, please?
That was Commissioner Ellis.
Thank you very much.